listening to Overwatch League Daily, your daily source for Overwatch League news, scores, and more. Here's your host, KickedTripod.
Good morning, Overwatch League fans. This is your Overwatch League daily episode for May 7th, 2018. Today I'm joined by Wilson Scr1be. He's a former writer for Ghost2 Gamers, currently writing daily recaps and weekly power rankings for Cybersport. He's also formerly the coach for You Guys Get Paid. We sat down and discussed yesterday's Stage 3 playoffs matches. Speaking of which, here's your 2-minute rundown brought to you by our patrons at patreon.com/OWL Daily Show. Today's 2-minute rundown was written by none other than Volamel. Make sure to follow him on Twitter at Volamel. The LA Gladiators come into their semifinal match as the 4th seed in the playoffs, but that does not mean they were the weakest. The Boston Uprising had the perfect regular season. Would they falter against the lower seed? It seemed as if the Gladiators were perpetually chasing a carrot on a stick, and this theme came to a head on Temple of Anubis. They would dive into Boston and target Striker and try to single him out, investing multiple ultimates in doing so. The LA Gladiators dug themselves deeper and deeper into the red as they chased after Striker. Fissure made Gladiators' DPS the space they needed, but Boston's defense was ironclad. Boston Uprising's mistakes and Striker were on a warpath which continued into the final. Their 1-2 punch proved overwhelming for the Gladiators to handle as they fall 3-0. The LA Valiant, the plucky dark horse team that underwent a massive Stage 3 shakeup, approached the mad titan of the Overwatch League, the NYXL, in our second match. Flexing their bench, the NYXL allowed everyone on the team time on the stage to warm up against a formidable opponent. Janice, Animo, and Pine all had playtime within this match, and they had impressive performances. Both Scr1be and Pine began to shine on the Widowmaker, and they both had some amazing performances between the both of them. On the side of the green and gold, they really were just overpowered. The overall individual performances from NYXL stifled the LA Valiant's flame, and they could never seem to find a reignition. Masters of catching the dive, the NYXL understood that Jonak had a target on his back and leveraged this to their advantage on Nepal and on Temple of Anubis. NYXL crushed the Valiant in a vulgar display of power, 3-0. So here we are in the Stage 3 finals between the 1st seed Boston Uprising and 2nd seed NYXL. We begin on Route 66, where Boston would hold New York just shy of the final point. Despite the strong defensive hold, NYXL would do Boston one better and halt the Uprising just 13 meters shy of their mark. NYXL takes Route 66 3-2. On Nepal, Pine and Arc are out, and Libero and Animo are in. No changes for Boston. On Village, Boston comes out to a roaring start with a 99% to 17% advantage. However, NYXL would flip the point and take Village 100 to 99. On Sanctum, we see Scr1be play Widowmaker with Libero on Junkrat. This stage of the map would go back and forth with Boston again at 99% before New York would flip the point back again and steal another stage. NYXL is up 2 maps to 0. On to Volskaya Industries, where the Uprising are undefeated so far. Both teams finished their first offense, with Boston having a 75-second time bank advantage. Boston would hold NYXL to no progress on point B. However, the Uprising couldn't get any more progress on their attack either, and they would draw on Volskaya. Boston needs to win on Numbani to stay alive, but they don't play like it at first as NYXL round the final corner to point C with over 5 minutes in the time bank. Boston would put up an impressive stall, however, and New York would barely finish the map in overtime. On offense, Boston would stall out just a meter shy of completing the map, and New York would take the map, series, and the stage 3-0 with 1 draw. So there you have it. New York Excel, congratulations on another stage championship. Hey, Scr1be, let's go ahead. Let's jump right into it here. The first 2 matches were kind of a blowout. We were just talking about it before we started recording, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on matches that weren't the grand final match, if that makes sense. But I do want to ask you something about the playoff format, because this is a brand new playoff format. And the playoffs have actually changed every stage, because stage 2, they moved it to Sunday. Now stage 3, it was 4 teams, with the number 1 seed team getting to choose their kind of semifinal opponent. I'd love to get your thoughts on the new playoff format now that we kind of got to see it in action.
Yeah, for sure. I think that this playoff format is slightly more favorable than the previous ones, just because you reward good performers. Having the 4th place team even be a contender is really huge, considering in stage 1 we had Boston just miss it barely. In stage 2 we had a few other very close placements as well. So giving the better teams more opportunity to come in and play for this prize is really important. I like the fact that we kind of reverted to how Apex does it, where the top seed picks their opponent. It's really good because it does mix up a lot of the matchups. It encourages teams to start planning for their opponents and create a lot more of these catered compositional plays or catered strategies for these opponents. I like how it gives the teams more rest. You don't really see like really exhausted teams. Like, for example, in stage 2, Fusion had to play a total, I think, like of 10 games just to finish out second, right? Losing to New York in a reverse sweep. So keeping teams relatively rested and playing around the same amount of games is also good for just making sure that the grand finals is as exciting as possible. But I mean, it's tough to say just because the first 2 games were just such blowouts.
Yeah, it was kind of weird. I was telling you beforehand I had to take my dog Choji to the emergency room, and so I'm like getting really crappy cell phone service, trying to watch the first 2 playoffs matches, and they're done in like an hour and a half. And I'm like, but and then I'm like, oh, what we should talk about? You're like, honestly, dude, there are blowouts. Don't worry about them. Which is, I'm surprised, right, to see that happen. So maybe we don't get that next round. I guess we'll just have to see. But I think this week was overall really interesting because, I mean, Boston had to play the 3 teams below them all in the same week, 2 of them twice. So it had to have been a tough week for Boston. They played the Valiant and the Gladiators, both playoff teams for the stage this week. NYXL played the Fuel and the Shanghai Dragons. So literally the exact opposite side of the standings. And, you know, at the end of it all, obviously NYXL took this one 3-0 with 1 draw happening on Volskaya Industries. But how big of a deal do you think it is that NYXL had such a light week while Boston had such a heavy week? Because I think it can kind of go both ways, right? Because on one side, NYXL really only had to prepare for playoffs and get to watch these playoff teams play and you know, kind of, I don't want to say phone it in, but maybe phone it in. On the flip side, Boston, basically, they were already locked in going into this final week. So, you know, they could really focus on playoff strategies, right?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of different ways to look at it, because there is a line of thinking that says, you know, you want to play semi-hard opponents on your final week just so you can get the warm-up that you need and you're coming into the playoffs like ready to go, like ready to hit the ground running. But there's also the problem where for New York XL, you have to think about their coaching staff right now. Wizard Chung has been notorious for coming up with these catered strategies, and he's so good at planning out like how do we bend off all your strong points and how you take advantages of your weaknesses. So Boston having to play 2 playoff teams just to keep that number 1 seed, which I think they definitely did value a lot. I think Boston recognized that, you know, playing the 2nd seed means you could end up with an inopportune matchup. If, for example, New York decides to do the big play and say, we're going to pick Boston for our semifinal opponent, right? All of a sudden you're out in the semifinals. So Boston had to try hard, and that gives New York so much more game tape to really look at and say, like, okay, so this is what they did against Valiant and Gladiators. Let's see if they repeat it again in the first round of the playoff stage. And having that confirmation that they do this stuff consistently is so easy to paint a picture-perfect strategy to really play against. And the opposite also, like Boston is actually a very, you know, clinical team. They do prep a lot for their opponents as well. But when the data you have is on Fuel and Shanghai, it's super tough to see if New York will bring the same stuff, just because New York doesn't have to bring their A game. They don't have to show everything that they need, that they're running. They might not even have to show their map picks for the grand final. So it is tough for kind of the differentiation between these 2 weeks. But I definitely think New York had such a better opportunity, both preparation-wise and rest-wise.
I want to talk a little bit about Volskaya Industries, or Uprising Industries, as it has been coined by the Boston Uprising social media team, and of course, Overwatch League casters and analysts, because they're so good. They're undefeated on the map with 1 draw happening in the grand finals. I want to say 10 wins, 0 losses, 1 draw, but I could be making that win count up. But they lost they drew in the grand final, right? So yeah. How did NYXL hold on against Boston in this map?
A lot of this just has to do with Widow positioning. I think that taking the first set of rounds aside, I'm going to kind of ignore those because I don't think either team did necessarily a great job at defensive holding. It more was of an offensive battle and really peeling for Jonak from New York. But on defense, though, Libero was just such a threat because the fact he was able to position like without the other team knowing and without mistakes, really kind of like as a Widow checking to make sure he's safe on the blind side. He was actually able to get a few blindside kills that really slowed down Boston's momentum. And while Boston is very strong on Volskaya Industries, when you're playing against New York, you need as much time as possible. And losing those initial fights really slowed down New York's progress. And that's kind of where the map really lies. At the end, though, it really comes down to stuff like Scr1be, right? Because Scr1be actually Scr1be and Jonak both make superstar plays at the last defense. Jonak makes the most notable play on camera, where his Transcendence actually blocks mistakes, Deadeye. I think he was trying to channel Deadeye on Arc, but Jonak actually gets in the way, so he's not actually able to pull the trigger on it, saving Arc in the background. But Scr1be actually comes up with a really big follow-up play where he takes out Kelix, who's trying to get a res off. Now, with the Mercy out in the last minute of the fight, Mistakes is actually forced to stop firing and trying to find a health pack. And while he's doing that, searching for a health pack, trying to get a line of sight, Scr1be actually takes out Mistakes in the back line. So there's a lot of big plays there, but it has to come down to ultimate management because we saw Libero hold on to the Dragon Blade until very late. Jonak also builds up ultimate very late in the half, doesn't really feel the need to throw it out. And I mean, Scr1be comes out with a bunch of kills all through that map. I think during their attack, he finds 4 kills somehow to keep them alive.
And it looked like they were kind of pretty prepared. Of course, it's New York Excelsior. They don't not prepare for big games like that because we saw the Genji right away. They knew that Mistakes was going to be coming with the McCree and stuff. So we saw a lot of really we saw some chess with the picks, and then as you said, ultimate management, right? Giant chess game of ults. And I mean, that's kind of what you want to see, right? Is you want to see these teams who aren't just, you're not just kind of putting 2 teams that aren't equal in skill. You like to see the equality in skill and see who's better prepared and who has the better strategy going in. And Nimbani, I think, actually really illustrates this point well. We were talking before the show about Boston's offense against NYXL on point A, Nimbani. And I want to talk about that a little bit. So can you bring us through kind of that first initial dive by Boston and how it kind of snowballed into NYXL's favor?
Yeah, sure. So Boston does this really, this constant thing on Nimbani, and I think that New York started picking up on this because Boston actually had done this before, I think, this week, actually. But the thing Boston does on first point Nimbani is they actually don't even dive high ground. So there's that bridge of high ground where a lot of defenders like occupying just because it's out of line of sight when you walk in and it's really good high ground position. What Boston's kind of stopped doing is they stopped diving the high ground because if you dive high ground, you actually let the defenders drop down. So what Boston's doing is that they're anticipating that defenders are preemptively going to drop down to kind of get away from the cooldowns. Because once you bait out Diva, kind of like Diva boosters and Winston jump, the tanks don't really have that much mobility afterwards. They're kind of like just dropping down. They have to like slow push while walk into you, which is exactly what you want to do. New York actually anticipated this. They did not. They put Pine actually on the total opposite side of the map, towards the actually edge of the map, and they kept him there and didn't really show him off. Boston actually cruises around the corner, notices that no one's really there, but kind of like doesn't really think too much about it, and he commits to the dive, only for Jonak and I think Arc to be super far back there. And by the time Mako is able to kind of counter dive, they're already able to split up defense. Pine's still alive, getting free shots, and the moment that happens, you have to think about Boston's side. They're feeling the pressure now. This is do or die. If they lose this map, they're done. There's no coming back from this. So Boston got a lot of pressure put on them because New York had such a fast offense where they hit 5 minutes going into point C. So Boston not being able to get that very fast first capture to build up momentum means they're facing down a lot of ultimate economy from New York. And New York doesn't burn ultimate throughout the entire fight. They have it all through the second fight, and New York's just simply more prepared in that moment.
And I think in that dive, I don't have the exact numbers, but I think it was like 6-0 or 5, 6-0 or 6-1 as far as deaths on each side, which, especially at that point, like that's a huge swing in your favor for ultimate economy. And if you can stay efficient, especially on Numbani, we've seen it before. If you can get really big wins in that first fight or two, you begin to see basically an offensive team that can't really catch up. You brought up on point C, I know it's going back a second, but Boston held point C for 5.5 minutes before just giving up point C in overtime to NYXL. I mean, what did you see that made that hold so effective, especially when they were basically defenseless up until they had it, right in Boston's backyard?
Yeah, that really comes down to kind of the Widow meta between a lot of the teams. Widow is one of the characters which right now is very hard to deal with just because Winston and D.Va, who are considered the hardest counters to Widow, right now aren't exactly great tools because while they can dive and they have the ability to really be super mobile, they're going to take a lot of damage, and Defense Matrix is not up nearly enough to really dissuade a lot of this damage from coming in. So Widow is able to kind of, if Widow stays safe and Widow kind of is just able to stay turret form and really just, kind of pick up targets, they're able to inflict a lot of damage on divers. They're able to control a lot of the squishies. And more importantly, the burst damage is actually going to knock out even Mercy pocket healing. That's kind of why you see like teams struggle when they try to dive onto enemy Zenyatas, is because the Zenyatas getting pocketed throughout the entire thing and they just don't have enough damage to deal with it. Widow is able to headshot, and the moment you kind of one kill headshot, you start delaying the push even more. And Pine was super countered by Gamsu switched onto Orisa. Having the shield in front of mistakes makes it very difficult to find picks, and Boston's very good at playing patient for the most part. So Pine just seemed like he was locked out. He was able to find some kills on retreats when Boston tried to push their advantage, but it's just tough when you're forced without an option. Pine didn't really seem like he wanted to switch. Maybe switching would have probably guaranteed the point. But Orisa is also tough against Scr1be as well, who isn't really able to dive that effectively at that point.
So since we're on the topic of Pine, we've seen Pine kind of come and go as far as, this is kind of a harsh term, but I will say his relevance inside NYXL. We saw him, obviously click a lot of heads in stage 1 is what we'll say. We saw stage 2 not quite as effective, and then we've seen him, especially in the recent weeks, kind of get cycled in and seeing that old Pine back. How big of a role did he play in this grand final match? NYXL has been in the grand finals 3 times, right? I believe.
Yes.
And Pine, I went and looked on Winston's Lab and the Overwatch League website. So if it's wrong there, you know why. But Pine has only played on 1 map out of the 10, because the other 2 went to 5 maps. Out of the 10, he's only played on 1 map in grand finals. How big of a role did he play in this one where he played a little bit more?
It's definitely, he played a really big role. Stage 2, so stage 1, he wasn't played a lot because he was more so like kind of like the specialist player. And I don't think they rotated him into a lot of the standard strategies for the map, so he didn't play there. Stage 2 was kind of like, I guess they realized he had a slight dip in performance and wasn't really like 100%, so they didn't really want to play him either. But when Pine is confident, Pine's actually one of the most impactful players because he's actually one of the guys who's willing to take these really really fine percentage, low percentage shots. And that's actually what makes his Widow so impactful, is that he's not scared to face off against mistakes. And in most cases, he's going to win these 50-50 battles where kind of both Widows either know the other person's positioning or both Widows have no idea where they are. And Pine was really victorious doing that. And the confidence for Pine to, take these really aggressive peaks, move up even further, try to get a lot of these aggressive shots, actually makes Mistakes, who is definitely a less comfortable Widow player. It forces him into these really bad situations where Mistakes is forced to kind of like pick off Pine and try to get these small advantages. But the fact is that when Pine plays more and more aggressive, Mistakes is actually pushed into more and more of a defensive position. Mistakes has to start checking a lot of these corners. He can't take these super advantageous angles or peaks because Pine might have them already. And that was big because, I mean, Pine was the big person to focus. When you were able to focus Pine down, New York did start to struggle. But when Pine was kind of shooting free and getting a lot of these crazy picks, he was able to generate a lot of ultimate advantages and generate a lot of room from afar. And that's kind of why the Widow meta is so strong. When you have that support from at range, being able to one-shot any stragglers who try to contest the point again, it's so easy to kind of cycle that lead and build into more momentum.
It's really interesting because Pine, even when he's not playing at his best, he forces teams to play differently and approach these maps differently than they otherwise would if you just, maybe stick Libero in there. Libero is probably a bad example because, well, he's Libero. But, another kind of hit scan-esque type player there. Something that has been a big topic recently has been Neko and Jonak, and they play very different styles of Zenyatta. Obviously, Jonak is kind of known for doing a ton of damage, and Neko, he's getting the credit now for being a great Zenyatta. Obviously, not all in all for the amount of damage he puts out, but now that we got to see both of these Zens play against each other in a high stakes match, do you feel that Jonak came out on top and kind of solidified himself as the best Zenyatta in the league, if there was an argument against that?
I think he does, but there is a huge caveat here, whereas you kind of have to look at what made Jonak so strong here. One is definitely the pocket. Jonak's very rarely when he's even when he's, I think, in really high pressure situations, when it's Jonak, Arc, and another DPS player, Jonak will typically still get pocketed in those situations just because he's so lethal at hitting heads and stuff like that. But Jonak was able to flourish a lot more because his team was ahead, and you kind of see that a lot more when Neko was actually getting taken apart by Scr1be and Mano jumping on him in the backlines. And Neko didn't really get as much of that support. And more importantly, when you're playing more defensively, just because Boston just wasn't in the position to really take a strong foothold and really allow Neko to play more aggressive, look for those picks a lot more, because they were always backpedaling, or Neko had to, play more defensively to avoid Scr1be in the backline. You're not able to access that fragging ability, and you're put on a lot on the back foot, where you're more so reactively playing. You have to just hope you stay alive after a dive, or your enemy team's able to kite for you. So I would say Jonak definitely was the better Zenyatta this game, but it has to do a lot of factors, mainly just the offense of Scr1be, Libero, and Pine were just playing so much better than Mistakes and Striker in some cases, that you just saw Jonak be able to access himself a lot more. He didn't really have to burn Transcendence very early, so was able to focus on his aim and winning fights. And that's just something that is going to make your Zenyatta play look very different and a lot harder to compare in this case.
Let's talk about Striker. I'm glad you brought Striker up because just like Neko and Jonak, Scr1be and Striker also probably two of the top 3 tracers in Overwatch League, at least I would consider. So, I mean, I think in the end, Scr1be kind of showed that with the team around him, he's the best tracer in the world right now. But how did Striker play for you? How do you think he did?
Striker did good for what he was allowed to do. I think New York definitely recognized that Striker was one of the big first people in for Boston. They recognized that Striker is very good at these chaotic situations in the backline where everything seems like it's amok. Striker's kind of just blinking around trying to find some targets. So Striker will find a lot of really good sticks and has the ability to chain a lot of kills together. But Striker was the first man in because of some of the mismatches on the team. I think the fact that Mistakes was limited onto the Widowmaker kind of forced Striker to play more aggressively and be that first person in and be the kind of the face of the Boston offense, which, makes New York kind of shift focus on him, and they want to take him out of the fight a lot easier. And Striker does strive when the enemy team isn't 100% paying attention to them. Striker's really good at kind of blinking around, corners, really trying to find where the back door is to dive onto supports, really bringing Gamsu as well. But because he was the sole target and everyone knew that he was going to die, he was getting counter-dived immensely. And Scr1be actually I think Scr1be in here actually demonstrated he was a lot more of a patient Tracer player, and it's really because of he was allowed to be more passive. Scr1be is the player. You see him a lot during this grand finals where he's not blinking in immediately after his tank's going. He's waiting for a few seconds so that the defense, the team that he's diving on, in this case Boston, was really thinking like, oh, where's the Tracer? Maybe like he hasn't blinked on us just yet. Maybe he's not close. And then just as they let down their guard, Scr1be drifts into the backline, takes out all the supports, and then you're just thinking like, wow, he came out of nowhere there. So Scr1be, I think, was able to take his team's advantage more effectively, while Striker was kind of put in a position where he wasn't super comfortable being this super primary carry. And it's just tough because you can't, like, saying that like, oh, the Tracers and Yada matchup is like really, you know, one-sided in terms of Tracer. The Jonak versus Tracer matchup, on the other hand, is really skewed in front of Jonak.
Right. It's interesting because I'm catching a theme here from your answers when I'm asking you about these specific players. And it all comes down to the fact that NYXL has forced Boston to play a different game. Whatever Boston was doing, or whatever tempo they were dictating, NYXL just kind of went, nah, this is, you're used to diving, you know, or dealing with Zen this way. Well, let me introduce you to Jonak, right? Oh, cool. You've got this great person in Mistakes who's playing some awesome DPS. Well, he's going to be stuck on Widowmaker for most of the time because, well, we have Pine. So it's really interesting to kind of see that at the end of the day, it's those types of factors that ended up giving us the result that we got. I've got two quick questions for you. I think they're pretty easy ones. The desk went with Scr1be here, but who is your MVP for this grand final match?
So I have to agree with the desk here. I think Scr1be is the MVP for this grand finals match, but maybe not for the reasons that everyone's aware of. Obviously, Scr1be is like, for his offensive performance, he was insane on Tracer. He was just staying alive, and that's kind of one of the underappreciated parts about Scr1be. Scr1be has this really good knack of just staying alive on the point. And having Tracer who's able to blink around really kind of like force people to really shift their aim a lot. And they're not really, and it's, if you use your blinks properly, you can kind of like juke out players almost entirely from tracking you down. And the fact he was able to stay alive bought New York a lot of options to kind of come back into the fight. The fact he kind of knew when to back off, to heal, and when to recontest the point also was very good there. But Pine actually was struggling significantly when Scr1be wasn't able to get into the backlines and kind of divert everyone's attention. So when the camera was on Pine, you see Pine getting all these really good kills, I think on Route 66 against Boston. I think Route 66, not necessarily against Boston, maybe against Gladiators. But when you saw Pine kind of going off, it's really because SBB is in the backline as well, causing a lot of trouble, disrupting the enemy backline, making sure that they're focused on the Tracer and not really on the Widow ahead of time. So that kind of like partnership and really having Scr1be be such a big threat where he's sometimes able to generate kills out of nowhere. And obviously that's an MVP level quality, but enabling his teammates to be so much better and really to perform above what they're given or above the resources they're given at the point makes him, I think, in my opinion, their MVP.
I agree with you. I love the take that you took on it though, because I think there is that deeper level to what Scr1be does rather than just frag, right? And so it's the threat of the frag sometimes that is all you need. So last question here, and I think it's another easy one. Are NYXL and Boston the best two teams in Overwatch League right now? And if not, who would you put up there that could challenge them?
So I think right now you have to say that they're the two best teams. I think they match up so well against almost any other team in the league right now. They're just significantly more consistent. Their win conditions aren't really based on people like players going off. Like London Spitfire and Seoul both have this issue, and even Houston Outlaws have this issue to some extent, where they really require their hyper carry player to go off significantly to really take off leads. But New York and Boston don't really necessarily have that issue. Obviously, they get these moments where Scr1be, Pine, and Striker just go off and collect all of these kills, and Mistakes of recently as well. But that's not what they're depending on. They're actually more so playing like the rotational game. They're trying to win by baiting in dive teams into a counter dive, right? They're winning by playing more defensively and forcing the enemy team to come in. So the way that they play is just so much different from what other teams are expecting. I think the other teams right now are still trying to recollect themselves. I think a lot of the best teams in stage 2 and stage 1 are in really bad rebuilding periods where the meta change has kind of forced them to reconsider what options they were bringing in initially. And now they're just completely restructuring, right? We saw Seoul play with Rouge Hong in the tank position recently. Bergering has just not looked the same since stage 2. And we saw him get reintegrated in this last week, and he did look a little better, but it's still, I think, a good amount of time before Bergering feels as comfortable. And Outlaws, I mean, they, after having a really good start of the season against London, they kind of fell apart to the end, and you have to look at like Linkser being the primary carrier, but it's also the fact that like they didn't really have any alternative options, right? Teams are just getting better, and your solo carry player can't be like the only person getting kills anymore. And Boston just has so many different options. Striker's actually transitioned into Junkrat as well is huge, because that was the big fear, was that Dream Casper before his dismissal from the team was, you know, the jack of all trades. He played everything, was able to be the X factor on that role. So we were kind of worried, like we hadn't seen Striker on that much more besides Tracer, even just some Hog and maybe some McCree. So seeing that Junkrat be really strong gives Boston an extra dimension. And for New York, I mean, dealing with Libero, Pine, and Scr1be is nigh impossible. Mix in Jonak in the background and Mano and Meko, who have been just such a great tank line duo. It's almost impossible to address all these threats. And I think that's really why Boston and New York are so good right now. The one team I could see giving them a run for their money is a Fusion, just because Fusion has kind of like these multi-tier threats. They have EQO, who's on a good day, could just go off, as well as Sanilo. But I think Scr1be is still one of the best hyper carry style players, because he's able to, you know, take these aggressive aim duels and still win, as well as, you know, immediately flex onto any character they need. So I think that Fusion is probably the team I would see to displant them. But I mean, Fusion has, I think, a little bit of other issues. I still don't think Fraggy is nearly on the level of a lot of these top tank players, and I still think that Fusion has a little more to grow, where they need to develop their younger DPS players for EQO and Sanilo into more of a character.
Awesome. Well, Scr1be, I really got to thank you, man. This has been a blast to get to chat with you. You're a fountain of knowledge, I must say so myself. So thank you so much for joining me on the show. You got anything cool coming up in Overwatch or elsewhere you want to tell our listeners about?
Yeah, so right now I just do writing for cybersport.com, and Cybersport is really great with just letting me kind of produce my own content. I do have like a weekly power rankings, which is really fun for me to do, because it's less traditional. Like I'm not quite edgy in there, but I do say stuff that, like, it would be, I think that a lot of people who are more PC about stuff like won't really talk about, like, oh, like, do these teams really need to be replaced as much, or who needs to be changed there? So that's always fun for me to do. And cool. I think anything where the writer has fun is always great. But besides that, just nothing else in the pipeline for now, but we might see something in the future.
Awesome. I love it. Leave us wanting more. Well, Scr1be, I really appreciate it. Enjoy your week of not having to watch Overwatch League. It's like that. You kind of, at the end of week 5, I know for me creating content, I'm fatigued, dude. Like this week is just so nice for me. I'm like, cool, I get to be doing something at 6 o'clock rather than sitting in my studio watching Overwatch League. Not that I don't love it, but man, just, that's got to be what? Tiring. It's a lot. It's a lot of hours of watching.
It's a lot of games.
And if anyone's ever in one of our match recaps and you tell I just gloss over a map, it's because I probably didn't watch it, because I need to just go outside sometimes.
Yeah, of course.
All right.
I understand that completely.
Yeah. Well, Scr1be, thanks again, man. I'd love to have you on again soon, and enjoy your time between now and stage 4.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure being on the show.
Isn't Scr1be awesome? Make sure to follow him on Twitter at Scr1beOW. That's Scr1be with the number 1 for the I. We've got a stacked week of Overwatch League Daily ahead in no particular order. I'll be joined by a few members of the Boston Uprising to discuss their Stage 3 performance, and looking forward to Stage 4. I've got the LA Gladiators performance coach, Blake Panashevitz, Overview co-host and all-around esports guru, Fishsticks, Bren, and then Hexagrams. You don't want to miss this next week of episodes. Before we get out of here, as I've mentioned before, I am currently campaigning for community lead for the United States World Cup team. I'd love to make content for you all as the boys from the US quest for gold. So if you like me or the show, click on the link in the show notes and cast a vote. The first stage of voting ends May 14th. Lastly, if you like the show, we are 100% supported by our listeners and viewers. Head on over to patreon.com/OWL Daily Show and get access to early audio episodes, game nights, and more. That's it for today. I'll be back on Wednesday with another episode of Overwatch League Daily.